"He's going to die on the third stage," Krivas said, his jaw plates clicking in what passed for laughter among the Veshtari. "Look at the mass index. Look at those legs. Those are not distance limbs." "Technically they meet the minimum threshold," Torvan replied, scrolling through the registration data on his holopad without looking up. He was the race commissioner, which meant he handled paperwork, not opinions, and he handled it with the meticulous indifference of someone who had processed 4,000 entrants across 11 cycles without once caring who won. Height adequate, cardiovascular clearance passed, metabolic baseline within range. There is no rule against it. There should be. File a petition. The window closes in 9 rotations. Krivas leaned back in his observation chair, the scales along his neck ridge flushing a pale amber. It was the Veshtari color for amusement, and the 3 junior officials sitting behind him caught it and flushed the same shade. They were young, eager to agree with the senior evaluator, and they did not need to see the human's registration file to know what was funny about it. Everybody knew. The word had already moved through the endurance trials campus like heat through stone, passed from training block to mess hall to the spectator pavilions, where the early arriving crowd had begun to fill the lower tiers. A human had entered the Valthran circuit. Not a relay team, not a mixed species exhibition bracket. A single human male had registered for the full individual circuit, all 5 stages, 72 Veltari of continuous terrain across the hardest endurance course in the confederated systems. The course that had broken Rethani pack runners. The course where 2 galaxy altitude specialists had collapsed in the 4th stage last cycle and been airlifted out with lung hemorrhaging. The course that the Veshtari themselves, the species that had designed it, considered a national test of character. Deshan Akafer had filled out the forms in standard galactic, paid the entry bond in human currency converted at the port exchange, and submitted his medical clearance from a human physician, whose credentials had to be manually verified, because the system had never processed one before. The registration clerk, a young Veshtari named Pelith, had processed the forms with the baffled efficiency of someone encountering a problem that technically was not a problem. Every field was complete, every requirement met. The entry bond was paid. There was simply no precedent for what was being requested, and Pelith had spent 40 minutes searching the rule archive to confirm that nothing prohibited it before stamping the form and sliding it across the counter with a scale flush of pale amber that Deshan either did not notice or did not care about. He was 31 years old. He was from a city called Nairobi. His listed occupation was distance runner, which the registration system had flagged as unrecognized and defaulted to physical labor, unspecified. He had arrived on the transit shuttle 3 days ago, carrying 1 bag and wearing shoes that looked like they had been repaired more than once. The shoes had attracted nearly as much attention as the registration itself. A galaxy altitude specialist named Vethin had seen them in the equipment staging area and asked one of the campus monitors if they were ceremonial. "They are his racing shoes," the monitor said. Vethin had looked at them for a long time. They were flat-soled, lightweight, patched at the toe cap with a material that appeared to be bonded by hand. The soles were thin enough that you could see the outline of the ground surface through the material. They looked like something designed to be thrown away and then repaired instead. Vethin's own 4-toed grip plates, specially manufactured for the glacial scree stage at a cost that exceeded Deshan's entire entry bond, sat in their custom case beside her. She looked at them, then at his shoes, then walked away without commenting. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like cruelty. The Veshtari loved the Valthran circuit the way some species loved war. It was their proving ground, their mythology made physical. 72 Veltari of rock desert, wind canyon, glacial scree, thermal basin, and high-altitude ridgeline. The 5 stages were named for the 5 trials of Koth Valeran, the legendary Veshtari endurance hunter who had supposedly crossed the Broken Spine Range alone during the second drought and returned carrying the carcass of a sand elk across his shoulders. Whether Koth had existed was debated. That the circuit existed in his honor was not. It drew competitors from 37 species, and the Veshtari had won it for 9 consecutive cycles. The current champion was a Veshtari female named Salith Kaur, whose stride efficiency had been measured at 94%, and whose resting heart rate sat at a level most species only achieved under sedation. She trained at the high-altitude facility above the canyon. She was sponsored by the Veshtari National Endurance Authority, and she had finished last cycle's circuit with a margin of 11 minutes over the second-place finisher, a Rathani distance specialist who had later described the experience as following a machine that does not feel pain. Nobody expected Deshan Akafar to challenge Salith Kaur. Nobody expected him to finish. The early betting lines, posted on the spectator boards the morning after his registration was confirmed, listed him at odds so long that several bookmakers had simply written exhibition entry next to his name and declined to take wagers. One bookmaker, a Torivine who ran the main pavilion board, had been approached by a spectator asking what the odds actually meant in practical terms. The bookmaker had thought about it for a moment and said, "It means if he wins, I retire." Krivas pulled up the human's training telemetry from the campus monitoring system. All registered competitors had the right to use the public training grounds for the 6 days before the race. The system tracked biometrics automatically. Krivas studied the data with the attentive interest of a man looking at something he found genuinely entertaining. "His pace is constant," he said. "Across terrain variation, across gradient, across the thermal sections. He does not accelerate on the descents. He does not decelerate on the climbs. He runs at the same speed regardless." "That is not a strategy," one of the junior officials said. "That is a malfunction." The laughter rippled through the observation room, amber scales everywhere. It was, in fairness, a reasonable observation. Every serious endurance competitor in the confederated systems trained on the principle of variable output. The Veshtari called it Kethvan, the art of matching effort to terrain. You surged on favorable ground to bank time. You conserved on unfavorable ground to preserve reserves. You read the course the way a pilot reads weather, adjusting constantly, and the winners were the ones who made the best tactical decisions about when to spend and when to save. Salith Kaur was famous for her Kethvan. She could lose 2 minutes on a climb and take back 3 on the descent. Her body, a mechanism of perfectly calibrated effort distribution. The human ran at the same pace. Up, down, flat, rock, sand, wind, the same pace. Krivas had watched 4 training sessions from the observation gallery. He had seen Deshan Akafar arrive at the public grounds each morning, at a time the campus chronometer marked as unreasonably early, before the ground's lighting had fully warmed, and before the maintenance crews had finished clearing the overnight sediment from the track surfaces. The human stretched for exactly 12 minutes, performing a sequence of movements that looked more like meditation than athletic preparation, his breathing slow and deliberate, his eyes closed. Then he ran. Not fast. Not impressively. Not with the explosive push-off of the Galaxy or the fluid, ground-covering lope of the Rathani. He ran with a rhythm that Krivas could only describe as mechanical. Foot, 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 foot. The same cadence, the same arm swing, the same slight forward lean, for hours. It was, to a Veshtari eye, profoundly boring. On the second training day, a pair of Veshtari junior competitors had jogged alongside Deshan for a stretch of the public loop, matching his pace with the kind of casual ease that suggested they were barely working. They held it for 20 minutes, exchanging amber-flushed glances, running at what was clearly a recovery jog for their species, their long-scaled legs turning over with lazy efficiency. They peeled away to their own training blocks. The human did not speed up when they arrived. He did not slow down when they left. He gave no indication that he had noticed them at all. One of the juniors mentioned it to Thesson, the Veshtari lead distance trainer, at the evening meal. Thesson was a weathered female with a scar across one jaw plate from a training accident 2 decades prior, and the particular authority of someone who had trained 3 circuit champions and considered the fourth, Salith, to be the culmination of everything she understood about endurance racing. She asked what the human splits were. Identical, the junior said, within a fraction of a second across every surface. What about the gradient sections? The same. Thesson's scale shifted through a brief, unreadable pattern. She asked what the human stride length was. The junior told her. She asked about the arm swing. The junior described it. She asked about the breathing pattern. Steady, the junior said. Completely steady, like a machine running a program. Thesson ate the rest of her meal without comment. Later that evening, she pulled up the human's public telemetry on the campus network and studied it for an hour. She ran the numbers through the standard performance prediction model that the Veshtari National Endurance Authority used to forecast race outcomes, the model she herself had helped calibrate across 9 cycles of championship data. The model placed the human at 137th out of 143, with a projected withdrawal in stage 3, due to altitude-induced oxygen deficit. The following morning, she was at the observation gallery above the training grounds when Deshan arrived. She watched for 3 hours. She timed his splits with a handheld chrono. She measured his stride cadence against the campus track markers. She watched him run through the terrain variation section, where the surface changed from packed stone to sand to gravel to volcanic glass in 4 successive stretches designed to simulate the circuit's diversity. His pace did not change. The chrono readings were so consistent that she began to suspect her own instrument and calibrated it twice. When Deshan finished his session and walked to the hydration station, Thesson closed her chrono and studied the numbers. Something in the data did not fit the prediction model. The model measured efficiency, peak output, recovery speed, oxygen capacity, and 16 other variables. It did not measure the thing she was looking at, which was the absence of variation itself. The model assumed all competitors would vary their output in response to conditions. It had no input for a competitor who simply did not. He is practicing how to lose slowly, she told her runners that afternoon, and they flushed amber and they laughed, and they went back to their Kethvon drills with renewed confidence. But Thesson did not laugh, and she returned to the observation gallery the next morning. On the 3rd training day, a Rathani distance specialist named Galish made the mistake of running the same loop at the same time. Galish stood 9 feet tall with legs that covered ground in strides the human needed 2.5 steps to match. He was the 3rd-ranked distance competitor in the Confederated Systems, a veteran of 6 Valthran circuits, and he had finished 2nd the previous cycle behind Salith by a margin he still considered an insult to his training program. His stride efficiency was 89%. His oxygen utilization was in the top 3% of all registered competitors. He was, by every measure the Confederated Systems considered meaningful, among the finest endurance athletes in known space. Galish ran the first loop alongside Deshan out of curiosity. Then he pulled ahead with his natural long-limbed advantage. Then he finished the loop and turned back to find the human still running, still at the same pace, still with the same expression of mild, inward focus that looked less like concentration and more like a man listening to music nobody else could hear. Galish waited. Deshan ran past him without acknowledgement, not rudely. He simply did not appear to notice. Galish fell in beside him again and they ran another loop together, and then another, and then Galish's telemetry pinged a fatigue warning and he pulled off to stretch. The human kept going and going. Galish stretched for 15 minutes, drank a recovery supplement, and walked to the edge of the track. The human was still running, his form unchanged from the first minute of the session, as if fatigue were a concept his body had heard of but decided not to participate in. "How long has he been out there?" Galish asked the campus monitor at the gate. 3 hours and 42 minutes. How long will he run? Yesterday it was 4 hours and 18 minutes. Galish watched the human's retreating form. Then he asked a question that he would later consider the most important question of his racing career. Has he ever stopped before the end of a session? Has there been a point where his pace changes, or his form breaks down, or he slows and then recovers? The campus monitor checked the log, scrolled through the data, checked again. No, he runs until he decides he is done. Then he stops, then he leaves. There is no wall in his data. There is no point where his biometrics spike or his pace degrades. He runs at the same level until he stops, and when he stops cleanly, as if he turned off a switch. Galish stood at the gate for a long time. Then he went back to his own training and pushed his afternoon session harder than he had planned, though he could not have articulated exactly why. That night, he reviewed his own telemetry from the afternoon. His pace graph was the textbook shape of a well-trained Kethvon runner, peaks on the favorable sections, valleys on the difficult ones, a wave pattern of strategic energy expenditure that represented years of coaching and thousands of hours of practice. He thought about the human's pace graph. A flat line, and he could not stop thinking about it. That same evening, in the high-altitude training facility above the canyon, Salith Corps' coaching team held their standard pre-race tactical briefing. 3 trainers, a nutritionist, a biomechanics analyst, and Salith herself, seated around a table covered in holographic race projections. The agenda was the same as every cycle. Review the top 15 competitors, identify the primary threats, map the Kethvon strategy for each stage. They got through the Rathani contingent in 12 minutes. Galish was the main threat, as always, with his long stride advantage on flat and downhill terrain. They discussed Vethin's scree-stage speed and how Salith would need to hold within 90 seconds of her through stage 3 to maintain the overall lead. They discussed a young Torevine runner named Kellis, who had been showing improved thermal basin times in training. Then Dreen, the biomechanics analyst, cleared his throat. There is one more competitor I want to flag, not as a threat, as an anomaly. He pulled up Deshan's training telemetry on the holographic display. The pace graph appeared, a flat line so even that it looked like a system calibration baseline rather than a biological output. The human, Salith said, it was not a question. His approach is unlike anything in our database. He runs at a constant pace regardless of terrain, gradient, or conditions. His efficiency metrics are among the lowest in the field, but his consistency is absolute. The standard projection models cannot produce a reliable finish estimate because they assume variability, and he has none. What does the model say if you force it to extrapolate from his actual data? Salith asked. Dreen hesitated. If I remove the variability assumption and project a constant output across all 5 stages, adjusting only for the cumulative fatigue curve of his species, the model places him between 40th and 60th. But the fatigue curve for his species is poorly characterized because no human has ever run this distance in competition before. If his fatigue curve is shallower than estimated, the placement moves higher. Potentially significantly. How significantly? I cannot say. There is not enough data. He is the only data point. Salith looked at the flat line on the display for a long time. Run the race as planned, she said to her team. He is not a variable I need to account for. She said it with complete confidence, and she believed it. But that night, lying in her quarters in the facility above the canyon, she found herself thinking about the flat line in a way that she did not think about Galish's stride data or Vethin's grip plate metrics. Those were knowable quantities. The flat line was something else. It was a question she did not have a framework to ask. She slept 4 hours, the same as always. On the 4th training day, the course medic assigned to pre-race screenings came to the training grounds. Dr. Oerath was a Sulf physician whose species communicated partly through bioluminescent throat pulses, and she had reviewed the human's daily telemetry with increasing professional interest that was beginning to shade into something she did not have a clinical term for. She watched for 40 minutes, her throat pulsing a steady analytical blue, and then she approached the human when he paused to drink water. Your metabolic cost per unit distance is the highest of any registered competitor, she said. Deadpan took another drink. I know. You are aware that this is generally considered a disadvantage. Yes. Your slow-twitch muscle fiber ratio is unusual for a species your size. Your perspiration rate is remarkable, but your oxygen utilization efficiency is ranked 139th out of 143 competitors. Your stride efficiency is in the bottom quartile. Your peak power output would not qualify for a Veshtari youth circuit. By the standard performance metrics, you should not be able to sustain this output for the full circuit distance. Deadpan capped his water bottle. What's the metric for not stopping? Oerath's throat pulsed a color the Sulf used for recalculating. She searched her diagnostic framework. The standard performance metrics measured peak output, efficiency curves, recovery speed, oxygen ceiling, thermal regulation capacity, and 19 other physiological variables. They did not have a category for persistence independent of efficiency. They did not measure the ability to sustain suboptimal output indefinitely. The concept did not exist in the framework because no species that the confederated systems had evaluated had demonstrated it as a primary competitive strategy. Every species optimized for efficiency. Every training program maximized output per unit of energy spent. The idea of an organism that competed by simply refusing to change its output regardless of conditions was not a category the framework recognized. There is no such metric, she said. That's the one I use, Deadpan said, and went back to running. Oerath reported her findings to Krivas that evening. He listened with his scales at neutral gray and thanked her, and told Torvan afterward that the medic had confirmed what he already knew. The human was physiologically outclassed and would be pulled from the course by the medical team before stage 4. She did not say that, Torvan noted, not looking up from his forms. She said his metrics are the lowest in the field. She said his metrics don't measure what he does. That is a different statement. Krivas flushed a brief amber. Every species thinks its peculiar talent transcends measurement. The Drenathi think their harmonic lung capacity makes them special. The Kellocs think their multi-stomach digestion is a superpower. Both finish in the bottom third. The human is not a Drenathi, Torvan said, and went back to his paperwork. On the 5th training day, something shifted on the campus. It was not a single event. It was a change in attention, the kind that moves through a community the way weather moves through a valley, so gradual that no one can point to the moment it arrived, but everyone notices when it has settled. The human had been running for 5 consecutive days at the same pace, for the same duration, without rest days, without variation, without speed work, without terrain-specific preparation, without any of the periodization or taper protocols that every other serious competitor followed. By the standards of competitive endurance training, it was wrong, all of it. And yet there he was, every morning, running the public loop with the steady, unremarkable persistence of a heartbeat. Competitors who had dismissed him on day 1 were watching from the sidelines on day 5. Not many. A dozen, perhaps, scattered among the spectators and officials who wandered the training grounds between sessions. But they were watching, and the looks on their faces had changed from amusement to something harder to classify. Not respect exactly, not concern. Something closer to the expression a person wears when they see a piece of equipment being used in a way the manual does not describe, and it is working, and they cannot explain why. Deadpan watched from the observation gallery for the 5th consecutive morning. She had told her runners the human was practicing how to lose slowly. She had not revised the assessment out loud, but she had also not stopped watching, and she had moved from timing his splits to timing something else entirely, the duration of his sessions. 4 hours and 16 minutes on day 1, 4 hours and 18 on day 2, 4 hours and 22 on day 3, 4 hours and 26 on day 4, 4 hours and 31 on day 5. He was not getting faster. He was not getting more efficient. He was just running longer. He is not training for the race, Thesson said to herself. He is reminding himself that he does not stop. On the 6th and final training day, Deshan did not run. He walked the course instead, all 72 Veltari of it, on foot, alone, carrying a water bottle and nothing else. He walked at a steady pace, slower than his running cadence but governed by the same metronomic constancy. The campus tracking system logged his position through the day, and several officials in the observation center watched his progress marker move across the course map with the unhurried steadiness of a minute hand. He finished the walk in the late afternoon. He ate his meal, he stretched, he slept. The night before the race, Deshan sat alone in the competitor's mess hall, eating a meal he had prepared from supplies in his bag. The mess hall served a standard multi-species nutritional spread, calibrated for 63 different metabolic profiles, but the human had politely declined and produced a container of something pale and dense that he ate with a flat utensil. Several competitors glanced at him and looked away. A pair of Rethani distance runners exchanged a look that needed no translation. A table of galaxy altitude specialists talked quietly, and one gestured toward the human with body language that was already starting to lose its edge of comedy. Salith Kaur walked past his table on her way to the exit. She paused for one step, glanced at his meal, glanced at him, and continued walking. Galish walked past 30 seconds later. He slowed. He opened his mouth, closed it, and kept walking. He had spent the last 2 days thinking about a flat line on a pace graph, and he had not found a way to talk about it that did not sound like it was changing something he did not want changed. The starting line of the Valthran circuit was a broad plateau of compressed red stone overlooking the descent into the first stage. 143 competitors stood in the starting grid, arranged by seed ranking. Deshan Akafar stood in the last row unseeded, wearing his repaired shoes and a singlet that bore no sponsor markings, nothing but a small number pinned to his chest. 143. Last registered. Last ranked. Last expected. The horn sounded. 143 competitors surged forward. The frontrunners hit the canyon descent at a pace that would have been suicidal for most bipedal species, their legs absorbing the downhill gradient with evolved efficiency. The Rethani were first in. The Veshtari followed. A mixed pack of Galaxy, Torivine, and Sulth filled the middle. Deshan Akafar was last into the canyon by 40 meters. His pace was what it had been in every training session. The cameras lingered on him for a few seconds, the way they might linger on an animal at a track boundary, and cut to the leaders. The canyon was 16 Veltari of winding trail that dropped 600 meters through walls of striated red rock, with switchbacks tight enough that taller species had to check their stride on the turns. The Rethani excelled here, their long legs eating the descents with a fluidity that came from generations of evolution on sloped terrain. Galish was in third place by the second switchback, his stride smooth and confident, his Kethvan reading the descent as a spending stage and responding accordingly. Deshan ran the switchbacks at the same pace he ran the straightaways. He did not widen his stride on the downhill sections. He did not shorten it on the turns. His body absorbed the gradient through his knees and ankles with a consistent, almost metronomic impact pattern that the course sensors recorded, and that a biomechanics researcher at the Veshtari National Endurance Authority would later request a copy of, because it did not match any known bipedal descent profile in the database. Halfway through the canyon, a Torivine runner named Kellis, the young competitor Salith's coaching team had flagged as an improving threat, blew past Deshan at nearly twice his pace. Kellis was running a front-loaded strategy, spending heavily in the first two stages to build an insurmountable lead before the thermal basin took its toll on his species' limited heat regulation. He glanced at the human as he passed and felt a brief, professional pity for someone who was clearly in over his head. Kellis would withdraw with heat exhaustion at the midpoint of Stage 4, carried off the course on a medical stretcher, his front-loaded strategy having spent everything he had before the race was two-thirds done. When he woke in the medical tent and asked for the standings, the medic told him the human he had passed in the canyon was in 31st place and climbing. Kellis asked the medic to repeat that. The medic repeated it. By the end of Stage 1, the gap between Deshan and the leading pack was 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The broadcast team mentioned this once, confirming what everyone already knew, and moved on. Two Torrevine runners had dropped with cramping in the canyon switchbacks, their sprint and recover strategy collapsing on the sustained descent. A Sulth competitor had twisted an ankle and withdrawn. The human had passed all three without accelerating. He had simply kept moving after they stopped. Stage 2 was the rock desert. 31 Veltaria flat, exposed ground under direct sunlight, no shade, no wind relief, and surface temperatures that climbed throughout the day. This was where the race sorted itself. The frontrunners who had burned energy in the canyon paid for it here. The Veshtari, with their superior heat management, their subdermal channels that shunted thermal energy to their tail ridges for radiative dissipation, gained their largest advantage in this stage. Salith Corps ran the rock desert with mechanical precision, passing competitors who were beginning to labor under the heat, their bodies spending increasing amounts of energy on thermal regulation instead of locomotion. She reached the Stage 2 checkpoint in first place, 3 minutes ahead of the nearest Rethani, and she looked exactly the same as she had at the starting line. Her Kethvan was perfect. Her body read the desert as a favorable stage and spent accordingly, accelerating smoothly, banking time against the more difficult stages to come. Deshan Akafer entered the rock desert 5 minutes and 30 seconds behind the leader. And the gap stopped growing. Krivas noticed it first as a number on his display, a split-time differential that should have been widening and was not. He pulled up the human Stage 2 telemetry and laid it against Salith's. The lines diverged in Stage 1, the canyon. The lines ran parallel in Stage 2, the desert. The human ran across the superheated rock at the same speed he had run down the canyon, and his body did something the observation center had not modeled. It dumped heat through every square centimeter of exposed skin, a continuous flood of evaporative cooling that turned the desert's primary weapon into background noise. Sweat sheeted off his arms, his neck, his forehead, darkening the fabric of his singlet until it clung to his torso like a second skin. His core temperature, which Krivas had expected to spike into the intervention range, actually dropped 0.2 of a degree as his sweating system reached full operational capacity. The system was not elegant. It was not evolved for economy. It was a brute force thermal dump that worked by sheer volume, flooding the body's surface with moisture that carried heat away faster than the desert could put it back. His thermal regulation is scaling with ambient temperature, one of the junior officials said. Krivas said nothing. He had evaluated 11 species with evaporative cooling systems over his career. None had placed higher than 14th. The data on his screen was beginning to suggest the 12th would be different, and the data did not care about his assumptions. Midway through the desert, Vethine the Galaxy noticed the human's dot on her wrist display. She had not been tracking him. But his dot had been moving steadily upward on the position board, and it caught her eye the way a slow leak catches the eye when the wall is supposed to be dry. The human is still at the same pace, she told her pacer at the water station. He'll break on the scree. He hasn't broken on anything yet. By the end of Stage 2, the gap to the leader was 5 minutes and 14 seconds. It had closed by 16 seconds, trivial, but his position had moved from 127 to 109. 18 competitors passed, not by acceleration, by maintenance. They slowed. He did not. Each one had made a Kethvan decision to conserve on the desert, to manage heat exposure, to pace themselves for the stages ahead. Each decision was correct by every training manual in the confederated systems, and each one had cost them ground against a competitor who made no decisions at all. Stage 3 was the glacial scree. 14 Veltari of broken rock and ice at altitude, where the air thinned and the temperature dropped, and the footing became treacherous enough that 2 competitors had broken ankles there the previous cycle. The Galaxy excelled, their 4-toed grip plates designed for exactly this surface, each toe articulating independently to grip irregular stone with a precision that other species could not match. The Veshtari gave back some of their desert advantage, their clawed feet less precise on loose stone. Salith slowed by 8% on the scree, standard for a Veshtari. She picked her way across the broken ground with careful, practiced footwork, losing time she would regain in the thermal basin, her Kethvan adjusting her energy expenditure downward to match the difficult terrain. Deshan did not slow. Krivas stared at the telemetry. The human's pace across the glacial scree was identical to his pace across the rock desert, which was identical to his pace through the canyon. The footing was terrible. His blood oxygen had dropped into a range that would have triggered a medical flag for most species. But his legs kept moving at the same cadence, his feet finding purchase on the broken stone with a persistence that looked less like skill and more like a categorical refusal to acknowledge that the terrain had changed. His repaired shoes, those patched, thin-soled things that Vethin had mistaken for ceremonial items, gripped the scree with a flat, brief contact that the equipment sensors could not classify. Not clawed, not plated, just present and then gone and then present again. His efficiency is negative, Krivas said. He is spending more energy per Veltari than any other competitor on the course. His metabolic burn rate is the highest in the field. His oxygen consumption is in the critical zone. By every metric we use to evaluate endurance performance, he is the worst runner in this race. Then how is he in 87th place? Krivas looked at the position board, 87. The human had passed another 22 competitors during Stage 3, all of them adjusting their effort to match the conditions, all of them doing exactly what Kethvan demanded. None of them had noticed the human going past because he was going past slowly, steadily, one position at a time, the way water moves through rock. Too slow to see, too persistent to stop. He does not adjust, Krivas said, and for the first time the words did not sound like a criticism. He pulled up the cumulative position graph for the human and overlaid it on the same graph from last cycle's winner. Salith's graph from the previous year was a stepped pattern, sharp gains in the favorable stages, flat holds in the difficult ones, a staircase of tactical victories. The human's graph was a ramp. A smooth, continuous upward ramp that did not steepen or flatten at any point. It simply rose, at the same angle, from the first kilometer to the 58th. Krivas saved the overlay to his private files. He did not show it to the junior officials. He was not yet ready to discuss what it might mean if the ramp continued at the same angle through stages 4 and 5. The arithmetic was simple. The implications were not. On the scree itself, Vethin the Galaxy was having the best stage of her race. Her grip plates were performing exactly as designed, each toe articulating independently on the broken stone, giving her a traction advantage that had moved her from 32nd to 19th in 14 Veltari. She was focused, efficient, running the Kethvan optimal line through the scree field, and then at the 11 Veltari mark a competitor appeared at her left shoulder, moving at a steady pace. Not a Galaxy, not a Veshtari, a human in patched shoes running across glacial scree as if it were a paved road. He passed her in 40 seconds. He did not look at her. He did not adjust his line for the terrain. He simply ran past, at the same pace, and kept going, and Vethine stood on the scree and watched him pull away and felt something shift in her understanding of what she was participating in. She finished Stage 3 in 17th place. She had gained 13 positions and run the best scree stage of her career. The human, who had no grip plates and no altitude adaptation and no training on this terrain, had gained 22 positions running at the same pace he used on flat ground. In the broadcast booth, a commentator named Esrel, who had covered the Valthrin circuit for 14 cycles, and whose voice carried the comfortable authority of someone who had seen everything this course could produce, paused in the middle of a routine position update. She had been about to read the top 20 split times. Instead, she pulled up the human's position graph, a line that had started at 143 and had been rising in a curve so smooth it looked drawn by hand. "There is a competitor I want to draw attention to," she said. Her co-commentator looked at her with mild surprise. Esrel never deviated from the script before Stage 4. Entrant 143, the human. His pace from the start has not varied by a measurable amount across 3 stages and 3 different terrain types. He is currently in 87th place and climbing. His method, if I can call it that, appears to be constancy. The gap to Salith was 4 minutes and 41 seconds. Stage 4 was the thermal basin, 12 Veltari of volcanic flatland, where the ground temperature exceeded the tolerance threshold of most organic footwear, and the air shimmered with heat distortion, so thick that the course markers wavered like reflections in disturbed water. The Veshtari owned this stage. Salith had run it 37 seconds faster than any other competitor last cycle. Her heat channels would open fully, radiating excess energy through her tail ridge, and she would surge while everything behind her wilted. Salith accelerated, 14% increase exactly as predicted. Behind her, the field spread and thinned as competitors hit the thermal wall. The Galaxy who had gained on the scree lost everything and more. A Torivine runner stopped, knelt, and was attended by medics. A Rethani dropped back, his long legs suddenly a liability, too much surface area bleeding heat into the superheated air. Deshan entered the thermal basin at the same pace. His shoes held. Vulcanized polymer composite, resoled twice by hand, and they held against ground temperatures that had softened the manufactured racing footwear of 3 other competitors already that day. His feet hit the hot ground at the same cadence and rose at the same interval and came down again with the same flat, economical contact. And his sweating system scaled. The hotter the ground, the more he sweated. The more he sweated, the more heat he shed. His core temperature remained within a band so narrow that Krivas asked a technician to verify the sensor calibration. The technician verified it. The sensor was fine. The human was running through a volcanic thermal basin at a core temperature lower than most competitors achieved on the rock desert. The gap closed. 441 became 402, then 338, then 309. In the observation center, Krivas watched the number drop with the particular stillness of a man whose professional certainty was being eroded in real time. He had evaluated endurance competitors for 23 years. He had developed the performance assessment rubric that the Confederated Systems used to seed competitors across 6 major endurance events. His entire professional reputation rested on the proposition that measurable physiological metrics predicted competitive outcomes, and the proposition had held, without exception, for his entire career. The human was ranked last by every metric in the rubric, and the human was gaining on the leader in the stage that was supposed to eliminate him. "Should I recalculate the projected finish?" one of the junior officials asked. "On what basis?" Krivas said. "Our projection models require a fatigue curve. He does not have one. He has a line. You cannot project from a line. You can only watch where it goes." The junior official looked at the display. "It appears to be going up." Krivas did not respond. The junior was right, and there was nothing to add. At the thermal basin's midpoint checkpoint, Galish stood in the medical tent, his long legs cramping, his pacer applying a cooling wrap to his calves. The Rathani had dropped from 3rd to 15th in a single stage, his magnificent long-limbed physiology inverted in the heat. He watched the leaderboard on the course display. The human's position ticked upward. 61st. 57th, 53rd. He is not surging, Galish said. He is running the same pace in the thermal basin that he ran in the canyon, in the desert, on the scree. He has not changed once. His pacer looked at the display. That should not work here. It should not work anywhere, and yet. The broadcast team had noticed. Esrael narrated the human's progress with a controlled intensity her viewers would later describe as unprecedented. She read his position, 53rd. She read his pace, unchanged. She read his core temperature and paused before saying the number because the number did not make sense. He is not racing the thermal basin, she said. He is running at the same pace he has run all day, and the course is doing the work for him. Everyone else slows at some point. He has not slowed once. At the end of stage 4, the gap was 2 minutes and 12 seconds. Deadpan was in 31st place. He had passed 112 competitors over 4 stages without once changing his speed. The spectator pavilion had gone quiet, not silent, the particular hush of a crowd watching something it does not yet have a name for. At the stage 4 medical checkpoint, Vethine the Galaxy sat on the examination bench, her grip plates aching, her body paying the accumulated cost of 4 stages of terrain-matched effort. She had dropped from the top 20 to 44th. She heard a medic say, "The human is in 31st. She stopped the medic, same pace. Since the start. Vethine pulled up the course display. She found the human's pace graph, a flat line. She looked at her own, a jagged wave of surges and recoveries, tactically sound, responsive to every terrain change, everything Kethvan demanded. His graph was a line drawn with a ruler. "We have been racing the course," Vethine said. "He has been racing the distance. We adjust our effort to match the terrain. We make 1,000 tactical decisions across 72 Veltari. He made one decision before the start, and he has been executing it ever since. What happens when 1,000 decisions each have to be right, and one decision just has to be maintained?" Stage 5 was the high-altitude ridgeline. 12 Veltari along the spine of the Valeran Ridge, exposed to wind, thin air, and steep pitches. The final stage, where champions were confirmed and broken runners were carried off. Salith entered stage 5 with a toot-12 lead and the composed expression of someone who had never been caught from behind. Deadpan entered stage 5 at the same pace. The wind cut across the exposed spine at speeds that forced smaller competitors to lean into it, spending energy on balance that should have gone to forward motion. The air was thin enough that several runners dropped to a walk, their respiratory systems unable to supply oxygen at the rate their muscles demanded. A Galaxy stopped, sat on a rock, and put her head between her knees. 2 Rathani collapsed and were airlifted. The leaderboard reshuffled violently as top 20 competitors dropped. Deadpan's pace held. His breathing was audible on the course microphones, harsh and steady and mechanical, a rhythm that did not waver in the wind. His blood oxygen had dropped to a level the telemetry flagged yellow. The medical team was notified. They checked his cognitive response remotely through automated prompts on his wrist monitor. He answered all of them correctly without breaking stride. A junior medic watching the feed turned to Dr. Oerath, who had come to the observation center for the final stage. His pain markers are in the critical range. Lactic acid in both quadriceps is at a level we would flag for intervention in any other competitor. Oerath studied the readings, her throat pulsing the analytical blue. His pace has not changed. The pain markers say he should be slowing. He is not slowing. The readings are correct, Oerath said. He is running through it. He has been running through it since the start. We simply did not notice because the level was lower then. 2 minutes and 12 seconds became 1:54, then 1:31. In the spectator pavilion, the giant display had switched from its standard multi-window format to a single split screen, Salith in the lead, and the human behind her. The production team had made the decision without consulting the broadcast director. It was the obvious choice. The story of the race was no longer the champion defending her title. It was the flat line catching the wave. Esrael's commentary had shifted from analysis to something closer to testimony. She was describing what she was seeing with the careful precision of someone who understood that she might be the voice attached to this moment for a very long time. He has now been running for longer than any human has ever run in a sanctioned multi-species competition. His pace has not changed. I want to be very clear about that. His pace has not changed by a measurable amount since the horn sounded this morning. The cameras found him, a solitary figure on the ridgeline against the sky, passing runners who had been ahead of him for 4 stages: 17th, 12th, 9th, 7th. A Veshtari competitor named Drenthal, a 3-time top 10 finisher with 17 years of circuit experience, was in 8th place when the human reached him. Drenthal had been running the ridgeline at a pace he considered sustainable, his Kethvan carefully calibrated for the altitude and wind, his scaled feet gripping the ridge stone with practiced efficiency. He heard the footsteps behind him and assumed they belonged to another Veshtari making a late-stage move. He glanced to his right and saw the human running beside him, eyes forward, breathing hard but steady, utterly unremarkable in every visible way except that he was here, at this altitude at this point in the race, and he was not slowing down. Drenthal tried to match the pace. He held it for 300 meters. Then his body made the Kethvan decision for him, his legs decelerating against the thin air, his heat channels struggling with the altitude, and the human pulled ahead by a meter, then 2, then 5, the gap opening with the inevitability of something that had been decided hours ago. Drenthal let him go. There was nothing else to do. The human was not faster. He was not stronger. He was simply not slower, and at this point in the race, after 60 Veltari of accumulated effort, not being slower was the same thing as being uncatchable. In the observation center, Thesson had joined Krivas. She stood behind his chair with her arms crossed and her scales at deep blue, the color of recalibration. "You told your runners he was practicing how to lose slowly," Krivas said. "I was wrong," Thesson said. Her voice carried no embarrassment. "He was practicing how to not stop. There is a difference I should have seen earlier." 1:31 became 58 seconds, 5th place, 4th. He passed a Veshtari competitor whose scales flushed gray-green, the color of alarm, whose stride faltered for 2 steps after the human went past. The telemetry recorded the disruption. Krivas watched the data point appear on his display and said nothing. Salith heard the crowd noise change. She checked her wrist display. Pace on target, splits nominal, she looked back. He was 300 meters behind her, not sprinting, not surging, running at the same pace and the gap closing because Salith, for all her evolved efficiency, was slowing. 5 stages took something from every body that ran them, even hers. Deshan had been paying the cost from the first step. His method was not efficiency. It was not Kethvan. It was something the Veshtari had never needed to develop because their physiology had made it unnecessary. The capacity to hold a pace that hurt and not stop, not to manage the pain, not to distribute it, to run inside it, to let it sit in the legs and the lungs and the back of the throat like a permanent resident, and to keep the cadence anyway. Every step a decision. Every decision the same. The gap was 31 seconds. Salith accelerated. Her heat channels flared, dumping thermal energy in visible waves from her tail ridge. Her heart rate spiked. She gained 10 meters, 15. The gap stabilized at 40 seconds as they approached the final descent. The descent favored the Veshtari. Clawed feet, low center of gravity, evolved proprioception. Salith hit the drop at pace, claws biting stone, and she felt the gap opening behind her. Then Deshan hit the descent at the same pace and did not adjust. He lost traction twice. He stumbled once, his right foot sliding on loose stone, and he corrected without slowing, his body making the adjustment so fast it looked involuntary, a reflex from some deep layer of his nervous system that had been handling rough terrain for longer than the Veshtari had been a spacefaring species. 40 seconds, 32, 26, 19. Salith could hear him, his breathing. That harsh, steady pull of air that did not waver and did not fade. She ran harder. She ran at a level her body had never been asked to sustain. The finish line was visible below, a white band across the valley floor, 20,000 bodies on their feet in the pavilion, the sound washing up the mountainside. 300 meters, 14 seconds. 200 meters, 11. 100 meters, 8. Salith Kaur crossed the finish line first. She crossed it in a new course record, 7 minutes faster than her previous best. She stumbled forward 3 steps, clawed hands on her knees, heat channels venting hard enough to shimmer the air. She had won her 10th consecutive Valthran circuit. But nobody was looking at her. They were looking at the ridgeline, where Deshan Akafar came down the final slope at the same pace he had started with that morning. His face carried an expression that was not triumph and not relief, but mild concentration, the look of a man completing a task he had assigned himself. He crossed the finish line 8 seconds later. Second place. Ahead of 141 competitors from 37 species. Every one of them physiologically superior by every metric the confederated systems used to measure endurance performance. He slowed to a walk. He put his hands on his hips. He breathed. In the broadcast booth, Esrel was quiet for 4 seconds, the longest silence in the history of Valthran circuit coverage. Then she said, "The human finished second." His pace from start to finish was identical. Every standard metric ranks him as the least efficient runner in the field. He finished second. Her co-commentator said nothing. In the observation center, Krivas sat motionless. His scales were flat neutral gray. Thesson stood behind him with her arms crossed and her scales still deep blue. The junior officials were quiet. On the valley floor, Salith straightened and walked to where Deshan was standing. The deep blue was in her scales too, the color of a known truth being set aside. "Same pace," she said, "the whole course." "Same pace," Deshan said. "That should not work." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one the cameras caught and the commentators would replay for cycles. Not smugness, not a grin. The faint, tired look of a man who had answered a question. He had been asked 1,000 times, and no longer found it interesting. "It's just running," he said. He walked to the competitors' area and sat down on a bench and began unlacing his patched shoes. Salith watched him do it. The shoes were worn through at the heel. The Rizoling compound had held across 72 Veltari of canyon, desert, scree, volcanic basin, and ridgeline, and it looked exactly the same as it had that morning, because it had been chosen for durability, not performance, by a man who could not afford to choose for performance, and had decided it did not matter. Galish limped across the finish line 9 minutes later in 23rd place, his long legs stiff with cramps, his Rethani physiology betrayed by the same thermal basin that had always been his weakness. He saw Deshan sitting on the bench and stopped. For a moment, the two of them looked at each other across the finish area, the 9-foot Rethani distance specialist and the human in his repaired shoes, and something passed between them that was not congratulation and not rivalry, but something closer to recognition. Galish inclined his head, a Rethani gesture that meant the distance between us has been measured, and walked to the medical tent without speaking. In the broadcast booth, The replay team was already assembling the sequence that would become the most watched piece of Valthran circuit footage in the event's history. A continuous tracking shot of the human's position marker moving from 143 to second place across all 5 stages, overlaid with his pace graph, the flat line, unchanging from start to finish. They would title the segment with a phrase that Esrel coined in her closing remarks, a phrase that would enter the Veshtari competitive lexicon and stay there, the line that did not move. In the observation center, Torvan was completing the final certification paperwork. "Will you be filing a petition?" he asked. Krivas looked at the human's pace graph one last time. A flat line across 72 Veltari of terrain designed to reward the species that best adapted its effort to the ground. The human had answered the question by refusing to acknowledge that the question existed. He thought about the prediction model. He thought about Oerath's metric that did not exist. He thought about Theson's correction and Vethin's line drawn with a ruler and Galish's switch that did not turn off. "No," he said. Theson uncrossed her arms and left without speaking, and the junior officials knew that by morning she would have torn apart the training program she had spent 20 years building and started again from a principle she did not yet have a Veshtari word for. They knew because the deep blue in her scales had not faded, and because she had walked out the way someone walks when they have seen something that cannot be unseen. On the valley floor, Salith stood watching the human stretch his legs with the unhurried calm of a man who had just finished something ordinary. She had won, and she knew, with a certainty that would reshape the rest of her career, that she had won only because he started in the last row. Next cycle, he would not start in the last row. Next cycle, she would spend the entire circuit hearing those footsteps behind her, that steady percussion that did not waver and did not fade, and she would have to run faster than she had ever run to stay ahead of a man who did not know how to go faster and did not need to. The betting boards updated. Next to Deson Akafer's name, the line exhibition entry had been quietly deleted. In its place was a number that would have made Krivas laugh that morning. Nobody was laughing now.